Just hours after I published my video, Transgender for Beginners, Answers in Genesis posted an article on Twitter entitled, "The Transgender Movement Has Shattered the Culture's Understanding of God's Design." I know this wasn't in response to me. I'm not big enough for them to notice me. Yet. But the coincidence was noteworthy. I hadn't planned on doing another video on this topic again so soon, but the content of this article was something I couldn't just leave be. It illustrates the hypocrisy of the church on this issue and reveals the bigotry beneath. Then, to add insult to injury, AIG posted another article by the same author as I was working on this script, entitled "Transgender Identity, Wishing Away God's Design." In short, it made my blood boil. So if you want to see Granny blow a gasket, stay tuned. I asked Jen of Jen's Little Corner to help me out as we're going deeper into this subject than what I can cover based on my own knowledge. I'll provide the coverage on the Bible and religious content, and she will address the transgender issues. But first, the comment of the day comes from Shrek's newborn son named Larry, who says, "I sent this, Transgender for Beginners, to my parents because my husband is trans. Hopefully they will listen and understand." I certainly hope so. Your parents are exactly the audience I had in mind when I made it, and I am dependent on people like you to send it to them, as they are unlikely to stumble on it on their own. Thank you for helping me reach my target audience. Please remember to hit the like button, and if you're new to the channel, please subscribe so you'll be notified of future videos. Now, on to today's topic. When you get to the article, it is titled "Transgender, Bringing Clarity to a Confused World." That sounds exactly like what I'm trying to do. We could all use more understanding in this regard. Are you going to contribute to that understanding? Your subtitle is "The Transgender Movement Has Shattered the Culture's Understanding of God's Design. How can Christians respond with biblical love and integrity?" A good question. Maybe there's hope for AIG after all. Maybe you really do want people to understand, to respect people with different points of view, and to love everyone regardless of their beliefs? Great. Let's take a look. Strange stories are now commonplace in our daily headlines. You know them well. A child who was born a boy has transitioned to a girl, or vice versa. Now the child is playing sports against girls and stacking up wins. The stories are still weird enough to merit prime placement on websites and in newspapers. But beyond acknowledging the strangeness of it, no one today seems to know quite what to do with such instances. Christians read about these stories just the same as anyone else. But we are different from our non-Christian neighbors. We do not merely have a nagging, undefined sense that something is wrong with these events. We know that such cultural developments are deeply wrong, deeply immoral, and deeply unfair. Nope, sorry, no love and understanding here, just bigotry. I'm going to set the issues of trans people in sports aside for now. As I said in my last video, I don't know much about it. I'll cover it in my interview with Jen in a few minutes. For now, let's look at the biblical issues raised. Let's look at your claim that 1. These are cultural developments. 2. They are deeply wrong. And 3. They are deeply immoral. How do you support these claims? Before we get to that, who are you? Who wrote this article? The author of the article is Dr. Owen Strawn. Is he a medical doctor? Does he have any expertise in the medical and psychological issues here? According to his curriculum vitae, he is Associate Professor of Christian Theology at Midwestern Baptist Theological Seminary in Kansas City, Missouri. Strawn has published over a dozen books, including The Grand Design, Male and Female He Made Them, with Gavin Peacock. He is a senior fellow and former president of the Council on Biblical Manhood and Womanhood. So no medical training, no psychological training. He has a couple of books on transgender published by Christian Focus Publications, both co-authored with Gavin Peacock, who is a professional English soccer player turned Canadian preacher after he retired from his sports career. So Strawn does have someone he's working with that knows something about professional sports. I'll give him that. So how does Strawn support his position? We'll cover most of the article, if you have the stomach for it. Here's a barf bag if you need it. He begins, "We know this because we love Scripture. We love God's design. We love the world God made and the men and women He created to display His glory." Genesis 1:26-27. But we also know the full truth about this place. It is not as it should be. It is cursed because of original sin. Genesis 3:1-13. As a result, humanity does not glorify or honor God as we should. In our rebellion, we take the design of God and try to remake it, rework it, and even ruin it. Let's look at that verse you just gave us, Genesis 1:27. It says, "So God created man in His own image. In the image of God He created him. Male and female He created them." This is the ESV. It sure sounds like God is making one person and making them singular, both male and female. It sounds like God is making a non-binary person here. I know other translations don't sound as gender fluid as this one does, but the point is that even translated by your own people, the Bible seems to support God making transgender people. Your Bible doesn't directly say anything against transgender people and even seems to support that this is how God made them. It is only in your scriptural interpretation that there is a problem with this. Next, you say that the world is not as it should be because of original sin. This is how you explain illness, death, pain, and everything else that is bad in this world. Most of these things, you agree, develop naturally. So if transgender people are a result of original sin, which I don't agree with, they would be a natural result of the fall and are no more to blame for who they are than you are to blame for being born a sinner in a sinful world, which you are if you buy into the doctrine of original sin, which you obviously do. Do you go to hospital nurseries and tell the infants that they are wicked sinners trying to ruin God's design because they were born in sin? How are transgender people any more responsible for being the way they are than anyone else on the planet? What do transgender people do that you see as trying to remake or rework or ruin God's design? You don't mention anything like that in your article. If you believe in original sin, God's design is already ruined. Transgender people don't have anything to do with it. Gender bending and cross-dressing are not new behaviors. They are ancient. See Deuteronomy 22:5. But what are believers to do when a society, not just random individuals, rebels against God and mandates that we accept and approve of boys trying to become girls and girls trying to become boys? I'll let Jen address the attempted slur there. Cross-dressing, as I covered in my last video, is not transgender. It is gender nonconformity. I realize that you have a problem with gender nonconformity, but that is a completely different culture than the one you are targeting here. At the beginning of the article, you described transgender as a cultural movement. Which is it? Something that has been around since ancient times, or a new cultural movement? The answer is that new options in gender expression are arising that were not available in ancient times. But people have certainly been experiencing gender fluid or two-spirited or opposite gender since ancient times. So what should a godly person do when society wants you to accept it? Accept it. This is how things are. How other people express their gender is none of your freaking business. If they aren't interrupting your church service, what difference does it make to you? They aren't following your interpretation of God's law? So what? Most people don't. Why would you expect someone who doesn't believe as you do to act as if they do? No one is asking you to endorse their choices. Just ignore them and live your own way and let them live theirs. Let other people do the same. Is that really that difficult? When people around us wonder out loud about the transgender phenomena, we can point them to divine design that appears in concrete language. On this issue, unlike some other apologetic challenges, we don't only have to refer them to detailed principles about unseen realities, as in the triune nature of God. Scripture plainly describes what nature obviously displays. There are men in the world, there are women. See Genesis 1:26-27. We have male bodies and we have female bodies. First, you've cited the same passages before, and depending on the translation you look at, it's not as clear as you seem to think. More importantly, not everyone neatly fits into the male or female block. Let's bring Jen in to elaborate. Okay, I am interviewing Jen from Jen's Little Corner. And for those of you who don't know Jen, could you tell the viewers a little bit about yourself?
Hi, everyone. I'm Jen, as Granny says, from Jen's Little Corner. I do science type videos and LGBTQ plus videos. On that spectrum of LGBTQ, I am both. I'm pan, I'm trans, and I'm also intersex. So I cover a fairly large gamut of those letters and
Wow.
have a lot of experience in that environment, both as an activist for over 20 years now, and just because of my personal experience in that environment, I know a lot about all of it, and I won't profess to know it all, and I know that a lot of the younger ones in the community have taught me heaps in the last few years because I was very set in my ways. Being in the midst of, I won't say that it's a culture because it isn't, but in the midst of people who are fighting for their rights, you get to understand a lot of where everyone is coming from. It's false to say there's a trans culture. It's not the same as some people would have thought there was like a gay culture. Well, there was a gay culture in the element of the promiscuous style of culture that you'd see, like equivalent to carnival or gay pride. Not necessarily normal gay pride, but I mean the carnival side of gay pride. But most people didn't fall into that. Most people were just your average normal people who get on with their lives. And whilst they may come out and have all this fun once a year, generally speaking, most people lead quiet lives. And it's the same in the trans community and the intersex community. We're just normal people leading normal lives. And the only reason why trans people are more visible now than they were a few years ago is because the pushback on trans people that mostly has come about after the advent of more openness to gay rights, because as elements of the LGBTQ plus community have attained more rights, the religious right, like in the form of the Heritage Foundation and places like that, have moved further on to the next people in the group that they can attack, with the idea that if we can defeat them at this level, we can move back forwards and take more rights from other people.
I see.
When they lost the gay marriage fight in most countries, they moved backwards and said, well, who can we get next? Trans people. And by association, a lot of intersex people as well. So two fronts from there, although it's harder for them to attack intersex people because unlike their tendency to deny trans people and just say, oh, it's a whim and it's your want instead of it's an actual physical thing and there's no choice in it. They can't say that of an intersex person. You know, if you are presenting with a medical condition, then it's very hard to say it's your choice.
Yeah.
So it's a very different sort of thing. But having said that, there is no choice in trans people either. So,
okay.
So that's where I'm coming from. I do science debunking, LGBTQ stuff, comedy and things like that. But I've been in the community for a long time now, and I know a lot of what goes on in it. But I'm not an expert by any means.
Okay. When I read the article that I'm responding to, the term transbender jumped out at me. I had not heard this term before, and I was wondering, is that an offensive term?
I think you meant gender. Was it gender bender?
No, it said
Oh,
transbender.
they said transbender. Oh, that's
Yeah.
even worse. Yeah. Look, the terms like gender bender and I guess their weird amalgamation of transgender and gender bender, which is what they would have been going for when they said this,
Right.
are meant from people like AIG as forms of offense. If I was just going to talk about something like gender bender, there probably would be people within the trans community who might refer to themselves in that term. And that's perfectly fine if you're in the community. But when somebody from outside the community is taking those words and using them in a way to demean people within the community, then it's definitely meant offensively.
Sort of
Their
like with
intention from that is offensive.
sort of like
Sorry?
there's certain words that black people can use about themselves, but white people can't use because they're
Yes,
offensive.
I actually was going to go that as an example, but I know a lot of black people don't like comparisons in that between black rights and trans rights. So it is a touchy subject to move on to.
Okay.
Whilst whilst there are parallels in that, it's not exactly the same in that while a lot of trans people are very visible,
Mm-hmm.
a lot of us just blend into the background. So for me personally, although occasionally I might get picked out, it's unlikely in real life. Online, it's very different because I'm very open, but in my personal life, I generally don't talk about it except with people who are friends, and I pretty much blend into the background.
Mm-hmm.
So in that sense, unlike people of color fighting for their rights, where you're openly that color and there's nothing you can do about it, there's no blending in that sense. There is difference, but there are a lot of trans people who cannot, for various reasons, blend in, and those
Uh-huh.
people face exactly the same type of oppression in that sense. So, those who would want to repress us either want us not to exist or be the people who blend in all the time, which is why a lot of us will stand up even if we can blend in and say, no, we're not going to do that, because we're not just protecting ourselves, we're protecting other people in the community who can't.
Mm.
And that's a fair position, I think, to take
Mm-hmm.
in that sense. But as far as terms like that goes, yes, it is very much like the N word in that sense. Like if you're part of the community and you're claiming back those words for yourselves, an example of that, and I could say it, but you wouldn't, except under certain circumstances, is the word tranny. There are
Okay.
quite a few trans people who will apply that term to themselves. I won't unless it's in an element of humor, which I think is fair for a trans person to use. But other people would definitely say no, no, no. And I would generally say if you're a cis person, then no, that word's really not for you to use. It's highly pushed on from the porn industry, and it has negative
Mm.
connotations for most trans people. In the same way as words like trap and things like that do a similar things. Although there are lots of people who will claim those words for themselves, and to them I say more the power. In the same way as I'd say to a person of color reclaiming the N word, go for it. Reclaim it, because that takes the stigma away from it. And I don't have any objection with that. But when you have an outsider like AIG going with, what was it?
It was transbender.
Transbender,
Mm-hmm.
or gender bender or something like that. They're using it to belittle people and say that you're less than human. That's actually quite often their intention. They're like these people don't matter as much, so we can demean them. And it's definitely a demeaning and derogatory term in that sense. And they have no right to that type of language. In my books, context matters, and in this context, they're using it as an attacking from a position of privilege to attack other people, even though most religious people think they have no privilege because they are the downtrodden. That's rarely the case, especially in Western countries. The religious people are the majority and they have most of the power. So
Yeah. Yeah.
those words are offensive in the way that they're used, but not always offensive. Language is like
Okay.
that. The intent is what makes something offensive more
Okay.
so than the word itself.
Okay. The article begins by talking about trans people in sports and specifically,
Trans women in sports.
right,
Yeah.
trans women in sports. Could you address that issue?
Okay. It's an incredibly complex issue, and it's specifically targeted by the religious because it is so complex, and it is the one that probably brings out the most emotion in people, and it's an entirely new talking point for them, because even though this was tried, like with segregation, like saying, oh, we can't have them compete because people of color are better at certain things and that's not fair on the white, this was actually an argument at one point that, you know, we couldn't mix. I mean, that's why you didn't have mixed baseball. You had
Mhm.
separated, but because there was fears that one race would be better than the other. I mean, it's a ridiculous position to hold, but it was part of that, and those sort of separation things have always carried through as people have moved further into other areas where they want to persecute. Whether it went down to persecuting gays and lesbians, to bisexual people, to trans people. So, but in the case of sport, there's underlying facts that go with some of this as well. We know for a fact that on average, adult males outperform adult females of a similar build, and a lot of that has to do purely with testosterone.
And
So
muscle
the
mass.
argument is that, sorry,
And muscle mass.
and
Men
muscle
have
mass. Well, the muscle
20%
mass,
more muscle mass.
yeah, that muscle mass comes about because of the testosterone, because the testosterone enables greater ease of building muscle mass over
Okay.
time. So it's why female bodybuilders who inject growth hormones, which are mostly testosterone based, will build up muscle mass faster than ones who don't, although it's really bad for them because it masculinizes them. What's usually ignored by these people is the counter effects of being on HRT for a trans person. So a trans woman who transitions will take very large dosages of estrogen and hormone and testosterone blockers. So they end up at a point where their testosterone levels is actually less than a cis woman, because that's a requirement of the medication, and an estrogen level that's equivalent to being in puberty. So a very high estrogen level and a low to no testosterone. The effects of that is the significant reduction in muscle mass, a slight reduction in bone density, and various other changes that brings people back to closer to the median. Now, it doesn't change everything. It depends on the age of the person transitioning. So if you've transitioned a little later in life, you've had more time with testosterone in your system, so you become more masculinized, and it's a fact of it. But there's point and counterpoint to that. When somebody transitions later in life, they may have a slightly larger skeletal frame, but after taking hormones for a couple of years, they now have a muscle structure that's closer to a cis woman's, carrying about a skeletal frame that's larger than the average cis woman for the same size. So you've got less muscle carrying around more mass, which actually is a detriment. Now, whether that overcomes the positive that you've got slightly bigger bones is questionable and dependent entirely on the sport. The science for it seems to show at the moment that for any endurance-based sports, trans people are at a disadvantage if they've transitioned later in life. So that extra carrying around of any bulk with less muscle means that for anything that has any endurance component, there is a disadvantage because you will tire quicker. There's two elements to that. There's that carrying around that extra bulk, and there's also the element that men and women actually process different types of fat to generate their energy.
Oh.
Yes, subcutaneous fat, which is the fat layers that develop on the skin, is the main level of fat that's processed by women to get energy, whereas men draw their fat from other sources. Trans women who take hormones build up a larger layer of that subcutaneous fat, which is what is transferred to energy, and the estrogen is the catalyst for that. So trans women become dependent on the same fat cells for generating energy that cis women do, but end up with less of them depending on how late they transitioned. So most trans women have this issue that they will have less energy. So if you're talking about running events, um, games which require a lot of endurance over the time of the game, like playing, say, football or netball or something like that, a triathlon or something like that. In general, trans women will underperform compared to cis women.
Okay.
The thing where there may where there's possibly still an advantage is anything that requires instant power, because there is some evidence to show that despite the muscle loss, the muscle memory to the power ratio for instantaneous action remains. This is probably only applicable to people who trained before they transitioned. So if they didn't train before they transitioned, they probably wouldn't have the advantage. But it's unknown because there hasn't been enough studies done in this field. I mean, the studies over the whole thing is quite minimal. So most of it is, we know the effects that hormones have. We know some of the effects because of some of the studies we've had, and the rest is guesswork.
Okay.
So that's why it's such a strong talking point. So
what about
when you're talking about instant muscle memory and power, you're probably looking at a case that there may be a case that trans women have a slight advantage for the same body type as cis women. So if you're looking at sprinting, so instant power to get off those blocks, the trans woman may have an advantage over the short distance, but over the long distance, the cis woman will run her down. I mean, you get that variance within cis people anyway. So,
right.
And that's highly hormone and genetic biased anyway. So
I was a trans.
the question is, do trans women fall back in line enough that there is not a significant enough advantage that it would make an overall effect on the sports? And that's the question that is still being answered in the science. It would appear that for anything that's endurance based, no, there is no advantage. Possibly in some strength sports there is an advantage, and anything that requires an instant thing, maybe, but it's unknown because that may balance out with the endurance issues. So we don't, and the fact that you have to carry around more mass with less muscle. So even over a 100-meter sprint, whilst you might get off the blocks quicker, over the distance, even over 100 meters, the advantage may not maintain. So there needs to be more studies done in that to actually know where it actually is. So the question mark in sport could be things like highly strength-based things in contact sports or weightlifting or something like that. Even then, there's question marks we don't actually know, and more studies need to be done. But I myself personally are of the opinion that the statistics show at the moment, trans women have been competing in sports, especially at the Olympic sort of level, for 20 years now, nearly going on 20 years, not quite 20 years. And some have competed before then because some sports allowed before. No trans woman has ever actually dominated a sport, despite what the papers want to tell you. It just doesn't happen. You get some who do very well, but if we're going to compete, some are going to do well. That's a reality. You would expect that.
Right.
The statistics aren't showing an advantage, and you need trans women to compete to get the statistics and to get the tests and to do the scientific experiments. Then you allow competition. You keep gauging and looking at what's happening. You monitor it, you do your studies, and if you need to modify the rules later to make things fairer, you modify the rules. But you start from a basis of inclusion and you work towards making the rules fairer. And one of those things might be empowered sports, perhaps women's sports, which historically have less categories in terms of weight, etc. than men's. Maybe they need more. Maybe there needs to be a handicap system and trans women need to fight maybe 5 kilos above their normal weight if it's a contact sport. And that's perfectly fair. If the science shows that to be the case, then why not do that and keep the inclusion in the correct category? I think that's fair. And that could also apply to people who cheated but have stopped cheating and want to come back after taking hormones. Yeah, you can compete, but you have to compete 5 kilos up.
That's something I'm going to put into the main video, is that there is a lot of cheating in sports as it is. Forget about trans people. There's so much cheating that it's hard to address.
Yeah, as far as I can see, the best system to go down is one of inclusion, where you keep monitoring and then you adjust the rules to maintain inclusion. This whole aspect that you often get from a lot of people who are gender critical, saying, "Oh no, we have to defend genetics." No, how do you do that? I mean, when a person is born, their gender is assigned by a nurse or a doctor looking between their legs. And that is it. It's not about hormones. It's not about chromosomes. It's not about anything else. And sometimes those things get wrong, as can be seen by the fact that I'm intersexed. I am what's called a chimera. I have both XX and XY chromosomes. So if my chromosomes have been checked at birth, depending on where in my body they took those chromosome tests from, they could have assigned me either way from chromosomes. When I got to puberty, I developed both male and female characteristics. So it's like, yeah, how do you assign me then? How do you say I should be in? So you can't just assign arbitrarily like that. And I think the fairest system is to always go for inclusion, but then adjust the rules to try and create something that's more fair. And we always have to remember, despite what people cry and think about sport is inherently unfair no matter what you want. If you want a fair sports system, and nobody will ever agree with this because it's not what sports viewers want, all sports should have handicaps.
Okay.
And that gets rid of the entire problem. Men and women can completely compete all the time if you introduce handicaps. You don't even need gendered sport then. But they will never do it because there's no money in that.
Yeah. I was a triathlete for many years, but I have some bone deformity. I have a severe scoliosis. And so I always had a real weakness when it came to running. And so I always competed against the course. I never competed against the other athletes. My goal was to finish the course, not to win. I usually was in last place in every race that I ever entered. But I won because I beat the course.
Yeah. Well, I played netball for quite a few years, both before and after I transitioned. So, and I love it. And there's no way in this world you could ever have said that I had any advantage over the other women in the teams. I'm not a great athlete. I just loved playing the game. And, that's what it comes down to. It's like, you've got to go for inclusion first, because inclusion is the best thing for people's health and well-being. And I would always go for that. Screw these people who only care about the upper echelon and elite sports. That's not where most people are at. And if you start putting inclusions at that level, they're going to filter down. And then what you're going to do is you're going to have a whole group of people isolated and not participating in something that's good for their mental and physical well-being. And trans people on the whole don't get a lot of support in that area. So cutting them off there is like saying, you're not allowed to be part of our society. And it is often the thought that comes to from these people, because they don't want to see trans people.
In the article, he says that we are told as believers that we are unfair if we oppose the mingling of the sexes in public bathrooms. Address issues that you yourself have faced from using public restrooms.
Yeah, I find this ridiculous, because it's like, the mingling of the sexes. Well, trans women are women in that sense, and trans men are men. But if you're going to say that your ability to go into a particular toilet is entirely dependent on your chromosomes, I have no toilet I can enter at all. But what you're saying is a trans woman like me would have to go in the loos with the men, which would be dangerous. Which would be dangerous for me. I'll try and edit myself. But trans men, and I don't know if you've ever met any, or you have met trans men because I've seen your interview, but after they've been on hormones for a while, you would not know a trans guy from a cis guy. That you're just not going to tell the difference between them. And their insistence is that they have to go into the women's. Now, how many women would categorically object to that? You've got this burly guy walking in there with full-on beard and muscles and everything, and no, they're not going to want that. Most cis women are going to prefer that there were trans women in the toilets who aren't going to be a threat to them. This whole concept of the threat of trans women is just ridiculous. trans people don't offend at any different rate in anything than their cis counterparts. So trans women don't offend any more than cis women. Trans men don't offend any more than cis men, despite what some of the naysayers say, but that's because they don't know how to actually read these reports. The fact is that you are more at risk from the janitor coming in to clean the toilet than you are from a trans woman who might be in there. Trans woman just wants to go in and do her business and leave. In fact, most trans women are going to be more scared of the cis people in there making a hullabaloo or getting them arrested in some places than you are of them.
I think more of the fear is not of the trans men, but the fear of men who will be claiming that they are trans, but they are not. And
Men who might claim that they are trans women but aren't,
yeah.
Which is totally rubbish, because in all honesty, if some predatory male wants to get in a women's toilet, he's not going to try to dress up as a woman to do it. He's going to put on overalls and pretend he's a janitor or a repairman or whatever else, because that's 100 times easier and more likely to get away with. So that this is just a furphy. But the same arguments were done about queers in our bathroom. Oh, these predatory people. Oh, gay men are going to be attacking our children, or lesbians are going to be perving on me. It's exactly the same rhetoric that was used to fight against gays and lesbians 20 years ago. They've just modified it to attack trans people because, like I said, they lost that battle and they've moved on to the next grounds. And AIG is doing exactly the same thing here. That they're just following a rhetoric because their Bible tells them so.
Yeah. And that's the part that I'm covering in the video.
Really.
Yeah. Could you respond to this statement in the article? We are labeled intolerant for failing to celebrate individuals who undergo physically risky surgery to alter their bodies.
I mean, that concept of saying physically risky surgery, that's just a load of butt kiss, because every surgery is risky. And people have surgery all the time for various reasons. And these people just won't acknowledge that surgeries for trans people are life-saving. Even if they consider them cosmetic, for the trans person, it is life-saving. You are genuinely dealing with people who are at the end of their tether, are not coping well with the whole situation. I mean, the thing is, most people don't understand what it means to have dysphoria, and that aspect of where the mental picture that your brain has for how your body should be is entirely different. And that you have to look at yourself in the mirror and go, that's not me, to be totally dissociated from who you are. Now, I realize that not all trans people have dysphoria. Some only have euphoria, and there's different degrees of that difference in the genetic structure of the brain that cause these different things to happen, manifest differently for different people. But on the whole, most people who would go the whole hog and have surgery have enough dysphoria to drive them to have that surgery. And at that point, you're not dealing with something that is a choice anymore. You're dealing with something that is a necessity, as much of a necessity as somebody who has to have a tumor removed.
Do some insurance companies accept that as a medical necessity and cover it?
There are a few in the US that do. Most do not. Even a lot of countries don't actually, even though countries like Australia, which have good public health care, only some of the procedures are actually accepted under that, and you only get certain coverage for certain things. So effectively, it is quite expensive for trans people to transition, which is really hard, because it is also, especially in countries like the US, very hard for trans people to get work and to stay employed because of those prejudices that are out there. And anyone who says trans people aren't prejudiced against, you just got to look what your government's doing at the moment over there. The Trump administration has just released a thing that an edict that it is okay to refuse treatment to trans people who have coronavirus.
Okay.
And that happened today. So to say that there isn't oppression, or that trans people aren't have less rights than other people, is just blatantly not true. This is why trans people have started to speak out, because the conservative elements in our society, especially those from a religious bent, have taken the next step on, and the fight is against trans people. So trans people have to bring up a voice. So people are saying, oh, we only just find out about trans people, and trans people are so noisy now. Trans people are noisy now because the conservatives made us have to be noisy.
Okay.
Because we had to stand up and fight for our rights because
Yeah.
they want to take them away from us. So all these things that they say, oh, the trans people can't have the rights to go into, trans people have had the rights to go in their identified gender's toilet for freaking years. Those rights have been there for years. What they actually want to do is take them away from us.
Yeah.
They want to have the right to bully and oppress us, and basically be the bigots that they are underneath, but don't want to admit that they are.
Trans people don't have a lot of numbers. They're a small segment of the population. Do you have trouble with that because of that, or do you have a good amount of support?
No, I think if you're really going to look at it, the majority of the public in most countries are supportive of trans people. There has been a little bit of a dip in that in the US, and a lot of that has to do with the way the Trump administration has come at trans people, under the guise of mostly from the push of Mike Pence, because we know how Mike Pence is.
Yes,
Anyone watching knows how Mike Pence is. And
I actually lived 22 years in Indiana.
Some of that support, but on the whole, the majority of people just either don't care enough to have an opinion one way or the other, or are supportive of rights in terms of toilet rights and stuff. Sports is probably a trickier issue, as we've already said, but I mean, on the whole, for the majority of trans people, we couldn't give a toss about the sports issue as long as you let us keep competing at the amateur level and participating. Most of us couldn't care less, because most of us aren't elite sports people, and we were never going to get to the Olympics in the first place. So as long as you let us keep having our fun, we don't care. As long as you keep letting us be able to pee in peace, we don't care. But as soon as you start saying to us, oh, no, you can't do that anymore, or you have to be unseen, we're not going to support you in any way, we're going to allow doctors to refuse to treat you, we're not going to help you if you're homeless, we're not going to help you if you're raped, which is stuff that's being said at political levels now, yeah, trans people have to stand up and ask for our rights. And as part of that, most of the rest of the LGBTQ plus community stand with trans people. Most of them do. There are a few elements who don't like the trans part of it, but the majority stand with us in fighting this, because they're aware that if these conservative elements win the fight against us, it goes back to fighting against them. They will use that as a forward push to go forwards. And anyone who thinks that's not their long-term game hasn't looked at the history of this kind of discrimination over the long term, because that's definitely the way that sort of thing is going.
Okay.
So, yeah.
Finally, I'd like to address a thing they said near the end of the article, where he says, transgender rules work only in a make-believe world. We should no more support their passage than we should encourage people to identify as felis gender. The term refers, I am not making this up, to a person who feels they are inherently a cat. I suppose we all have days when we like to curl up on the couch, but all joking aside, there is no such reality. To use the language of my grandparents' generation, this is nonsense, plain and simple.
Yeah, I like the way that they frame it as a fictional world, when we're talking about answers in Genesis, people who believe the universe is 5,000 years old, and that Jesus was nailed to a cross and died and rose 3 days later. I mean, come on, guys, you believe in a God who made the entire universe in 7 days and then flooded the earth with water that doesn't even exist on our planet. Who's living in the illusionary world here? We have the science to back up why people are trans, why this happens, how the brain differences are working. That they've even got tests that, whilst they can't show that somebody is trans, they can certainly show through brain scans that somebody has a tendency to be trans. So we know that the brain develops in a different way. We know that gender identity is solidified by about the age of 2, and that most of the concepts of gender identity you are born with. So saying that people are just being forced that way by their parents or their peers or is just a load of drivel. The problem is if you push this aside and you don't provide proper support to trans people through the medical fraternity, you start pushing support for trans people underground, which means a lot of trans people won't be able to get support, so a lot will commit suicide. Those that do get support underground will be people who actually haven't had support when they needed it. So you'll have people taking hormones that they've bought illegally. You'll have people seeking surgeries from doctors who are a little illegitimate in foreign countries and things like that. And you end up with a culture of people who may or may not be trans, who may have just been messed up in some other way, going the backyard street way of doing things and ending up with regret. And this does happen because there are other symptoms that of mental illness that can make people think they are trans when they are not. And people will go through the whole thing. Most of these people get weeded out when they get proper therapy and they get proper support, especially young people. Desistance rates in countries like Australia, desistance is what they call it when people stop transitioning and say, oh, I was wrong, I'm not trans. Desistance rates in countries like Australia, where we have good support for trans people, are less than 3%. So you think about that. You're already talking about a minority of the population, and only 3% of that minority might desist. And remember, there are multiple reasons for desistance, and a lot of reasons for desistance are peer and family pressure. So they're not necessarily because they're not trans, it's just that they can't cope with it because the family's against them. And I totally get that. So you end up with this really low desistance rates in countries like Australia, and yet somewhere like the US, where, especially in states where it's harder for people to get support, you can have desistance rates that actually almost double that. And it's because you're not giving the right support to the people at the right time so that they can gauge where they're at. A lot of people say, like when we're talking about young trans people, oh, should we be giving puberty blockers for them? Shouldn't we just let them go through puberty and see where they end up at? Yeah. Here's the thing about this. If you're dealing with a kid who, say, has who has precocious puberty, so the puberty starts early, there is no harm about giving those kids puberty blockers to delay that puberty so that they can have it at a time when they're more capable of dealing with it. Okay. For a trans person, you're talking about them going through a puberty that isn't right for them, doesn't match their mental image of themselves. It floods their brains with hormones that their brain's not actually got the right receptors for, because there are varying receptors for both estrogen and testosterone, and the rates of those receptors vary within trans people. So you're actually going to flood them with something that's going to cause them an awful lot of distress. Isn't it better if there is a strong percentage chance that this person who's saying they're trans is trans, to delay puberty to give them a chance to know who they are themselves? Isn't that the fair thing to do to them? And we're only talking delaying puberty for maybe 3 to 4 years, which is no different to what you do it for early onset puberty. So, okay, they're going to start puberty later than their peers, but isn't that better for them than having to go through the wrong puberty amongst their peers and maybe commit suicide because of it? Now, to my thoughts, giving them the drugs is saving lives. And if the kid turns out not to be trans, then you just take them off them and the normal puberty starts up and they go through a normal puberty.
Is there any long-term effect from that?
Sorry?
Is there any long-term effect from having delayed puberty?
Okay, there is people often say, "Oh, there's no study in trans people." Yeah, well, the drugs have been used now for about 20 years in trans people, but for kids with early onset puberty, we're talking about 40 plus years of data. So there's aspects of a delayed cognitive development because you're entering puberty later, so those last few years of brain development happen a little bit later. But it's no different than somebody who has a late puberty. Right. It just means you're being delayed in getting into those levels of maturity and brain development. there is some aspect of concern that delaying it may actually reduce bone density, which would mean that there's a bigger issue maybe later in life for osteoporosis, although the data to support that is minimal and probably requires more studies. But there doesn't seem to be long-term effects for the kids who have early onset puberty taking them. So in the scheme of things, I think the negatives for taking them compared to the positive outcomes for the trans kids, yeah, I think overall you're looking at a net positive there. Now, of course, the argument is, oh, well, what about the cis kid who thought they were trans but isn't and ended up with the drugs? Now they've only got the negatives. They don't have the positives. 3%. So you're telling me that 97% of those kids have to suffer for that 3%.
Yeah.
I don't see that is in any way a fair equation. We should be supporting these trans kids. Now, I'm not saying we should just willy-nilly giving out the drugs. There are kids who we can tell by the way they react and what they ask for and the way they respond to the questions that are given to kids during the psychological analysis, how strong their dysphoria is. And there are certainly kids who are more in need of puberty blockers than others, because you have non-binary kids, and some of those kids aren't going to have those same negative effects if they go through partly the wrong puberty. So it's a case of learning from the kids and having the right support, the right psychological analysis, the right supports from family and doctors so that we can make these correct decisions for these kids. But calling out that we should block them is just a ridiculous situation and shouldn't actually be on the cards as far as I'm concerned. I don't think parents should be chastised for saying, no, I really don't want my kids to be on drugs, because I totally get that as a parent. But I think it should be encouraged as an option, not pushed as an option, if that makes sense.
Yes.
Because that supports the kid, and there should be more support structures for these kids so that they have less issues as they go through things. As far as the other thing goes about it being the same as somebody being a furry or somebody who's thinking they're a cat, well, here's the thing. The differences between men and women's brains categorized in the sections of the brains as they develop and the amount of grey and white matter within them. These are measurable differences we can see between men and women's brains, and we can see the differences between how trans people's brains develop and how they're closer to the gender they identify as, rather than the gender that the doctor or midwife identified them as. So we can tell that there are these differences in the brain development, and that's where these people are. So as far as somebody being a cat, actually saying I am definitely a cat, as opposed to sometimes I feel like a cat. Sometimes I feel like a cat is perfectly fine. I don't have a problem with somebody saying that. What difference does that make? As long as they're not hurting somebody else, who are you to give a shit? Is basically my stance on that. These people are just ridiculous in their arguments. But we also do know that a human brain doesn't look like a cat's brain. So whilst it's not ridiculous that people can have a feeling that they identify with an animal, I mean, in history, we have that with Indians identifying with spiritual animals and things like that. You know, there's a long history of this sort of thing. So we know it's a part of brain development as well. So there's nothing wrong with that. But a step from that to saying that you are actually a cat, well, most of these people don't even say that. You know, but to have a brain that's developed in the opposite gender path is something that we know happens. We have the scientific proof to back it up. So these people are just talking out their backsides when they're saying, oh, it's a fantasy world, because it's not. The fantasy world is the one that they live in, where they're praying to their fantasy god. It's not the one that science shows that trans people are a real thing and there's real brain developments that back this up.
I have a question from Epileptic Skeptic, who asks, do trans people really appreciate when allies wear pins in public that say, I'll go with you?
Most of us do. It's a case of it's nice to see that people are supportive of trans people, that you know that there's these people who you'll be safe with, and that there are cis people who will back up and stand beside trans people and say, hey, look, we're on your side. We don't see you as a threat. We see you as who you are. And I think that's a good thing. The more allies we have, the better. educating people who want to be allies into trans issues and doing it in a friendly, helpful way is so much better than being antagonistic.
Okay.
The last thing any trans person wants to be is antagonistic towards other people in the community. We want to be supportive back to you guys because we want your support for us. So I would much rather be friends with people and explain things to people than saying, oh, no, you've been horrible to me, you misgendered me, or whatever else. I mean, not that I get much of that, unless, of course, it's some Christian trying to be an absolute prick. But on the whole, I find the community very supportive of trans people and standing up for us. So there's that. I think we have a really good community here.
Okay. Thank you very much for helping me with my video, Jen.
No worries. Anytime.
Okay. Bye-bye.
Okay. Bye.
So, returning to the article, do you have a better grasp on reality? Let's take a look. We are encouraged today to dress the same, fill all the same roles in life, and blur the uniqueness of our God-given gender. But God does not want us to sanctify androgyny, gender ambiguity. The Lord wants us to revel in our manliness or womanliness. See 1 Corinthians 11:11-16. He himself made us a man or a woman. Christians have the delightful duty of celebrating God's design by embracing their biological sex. Let's look at that Bible passage that you referenced. It says, "Nevertheless, in the Lord, woman is not independent of man, nor is man independent of woman. For as a woman came from man, so also man is born of woman. But everything comes from God. Judge for yourselves. Is it proper for a woman to pray to God with her head uncovered? Does not the very nature of things teach you, if a man has long hair, it is a disgrace to him, but that if a woman has long hair, it is her glory? For long hair is given to her as a covering." Seriously? Really? You call this common sense and what God wants of you? Then why don't you follow it? The passage clearly tells women to cover their heads, and yet our culture doesn't require this of women. You say people need to follow the Bible regardless of what culture does, but few Christians in Western culture actually do this. The Amish and the Mennonite women do cover their heads. They are a notable exception. I have seen individual women in churches that I have attended cover their heads because of this verse. The Amish and Mennonite always wear a head cover because the mandate is that a woman is to be covered when she prays, and you never know when you might say, "Lord, help me," and need a head cover to do that. So just always wear it. Women who wear a cover only in church still violate this verse if they utter a prayer without a covering. I have heard pastors say that we don't need to follow this verse because the correct way to translate this is unclear, that the Greek word for cover here could be translated covered, uncovered, tied, or loose. Interestingly, the Mennonite women cover all the bases. They wear a cover that doesn't cover all of the hair, as the Amish do. They don't allow their women to cut their hair, so they all have long hair. And then they tie their hair, but not all of it. So they are covered, uncovered, they have loose hair, and tied hair. But if the scripture on this point is so unclear that no one is sure if they are following it correctly, you don't get to point to that same verse and say trans people need to live their lives by this doctrine that even you don't understand. What is really infuriating is the way you decide what in your Bible you want to follow and what you don't. You don't like trans people, so you try to make your Bible say that this is wrong, when it is clearly silent on the issue. But at the same time, you overlook the acceptable sins that people around you are constantly committing. Sins like greed, gluttony, lying, and hate. If you spent as much time and energy trying to fix the real problems in this world, like hunger, homelessness, or bigotry in the world would be a better place. Doesn't your Bible say to feed the hungry and care for the sick? Please stick to the parts of the Bible that you're better at. Furthermore, there's nothing in this passage about sexual expression. It says that men and women are dependent on each other. In the time that this was written, that was true because career options were extremely limited for women. It says that if a man has long hair, it is a disgrace to him. But the Bible also says a man shouldn't cut his hair if he has taken a Nazirite vow, number 6. It's why Samson had long hair. And look at the way Jesus is usually depicted. He has long hair. Now, I realize that we have no idea what Jesus really looked like, but if it isn't a disgrace to see Jesus this way, and men who took a Nazirite vow were to have long hair, why do you think it is a disgrace to see men with long hair today? It obviously is not the very nature of things, as the passage says, and you state in your article. Jesus had long hair. He wore what by today's standards would be considered a dress. If Jesus can express his gender this way, then people today can too. Okay, I'm better now. Let's see what else you have to say. The early chapters of Genesis are not religious fiction. When God made the first man, he really did form him from the dust, Genesis 2:7. When God made the first woman, he really did form her from Adam's rib, Genesis 2:21-22. We cannot miss the connection here. If Genesis 2 is merely poetic in nature, then human biology is malleable in character. If the man and woman are not made by God, as Scripture says they are, then human identity, including the sexes, really is up for grabs. You point to God making man from the dust, then a woman from the man's rib to illustrate that biology is not malleable? God formed male parts from dirt. It looks like it was malleable. God made female parts from male parts. It looks like they were malleable. It looks a lot like transgender. Even if we take this literally true, we get malleable people where a man, or at least part of one, can clearly be made into a woman. The passage doesn't support your point. So if the Genesis passage is literally true, biology is malleable. And if it is metaphor, biology is still malleable. You should be good with transgender people then. He was trans. Transgender rules confuse these embodied truths, but we have the chance to untangle the madness for people. What transgender rules? There are no transgender rules, so there's no madness for you to untangle. Embracing transgenderism, whether individually or societally, is first and foremost an offense to our Creator God. Why do you think so? You fail to show that anything in the Bible supports this idea. Men and women of any age who flirt with such temptations, who listen to the serpent's whisper, are in mortal danger. They face hell for their sin. We must tell them the truth about their rebellion against a holy and righteous God. We must tell them about the cross and the resurrection of Christ. In Jesus' shed blood we find forgiveness. In the risen Savior we find power over the grave. In this news, and no elaborate gender theory from a college classroom, that sinners just like us desperately need. Okay, you have your beliefs. You are welcome to them. Under one condition. You are welcome to express your ideas, but when you cross the line and use condescending slurs and bigoted language, shaming people for being who they are is not your right. If you keep making stupid statements that intend to hurt people, then I will keep magnifying why your position is not only wrong based on current science and medical knowledge, but why even your own Bible doesn't support you. You are a hypocrite and a bigot. Okay, gasket's all blown. I need a little help getting myself back together. Maybe Godless Engineer can help.
No problem, Granny.
I haven't even touched on the second article. It has a lot in it, not only on trans issues, but gay issues and women's issues. So I'll tackle that one after I get my gaskets all back in place. I'm going to do something a little lighter next week and then return to this topic later. Hopefully, AIG and Strong can find something else to do for a bit so that I can, and you can, live your life.